I have mentioned throughout the last week, as this bill was passing through committee and passing to the House, and our audience is fired up about it, that based on everyone I've talked to, including the negotiation, people close to the negotiation, is that they were never allowed to talk about the defense budget. In fact, Lindsey Graham said he was going to vote against it if he did not get a 3% automatic hike to the defense budget, the war machine. Look, I think we need to balance the budget. We need severe cuts across the board, including in the Department of Defense. So, Colonel, just riff on this for a second. Is there waste, fraud, and abuse? Are there things that we can specifically cut in the Department of Defense budget?
What a loaded question, Charlie. Yeah, I think so. The first is the so-called national military strategy, which you could rename the national interventionist strategy.
Yes.
You don't really have a defense strategy. So the first thing you've got to do is you develop a new national military strategy. Point number one, you declare that you are not going to be interventionist. We're not going to interfere in the affairs of other people. Secondly, we're not going to insist that our allies join us in future interventions. We're going to tell the allies, look, in the event of war, you've got to be your own first responder. This notion of maintaining huge forces overseas to reassure people on other continents is a disaster. Technology has changed now. If you put a lot of forces, particularly on the ground, forward in any of the theaters, you're going to lose them because we have this thing called precision strike. And the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, you name it, everybody on the planet now has access to the microcircuitry for that. Then the next thing you've got to do is understand that this military establishment that Graham wants to desperately protect hasn't really been subject to fundamental overhaul and reform for 50 years. So you're staring at an enormous dinosaur, and then underpinning the dinosaur are hundreds of programs that are supposed to provide more capability. And in reality, these things haven't had much value since they were first conceived of. And many of them have dragged on for 20 or 30 years. They become feeding programs for people like Graham and his friends on the Hill. So the bottom line is, sure, you can do all of those things. And then after you've made the basic changes in your strategy, you've got to go after the overhead. Charlie, we have 44 four-star generals and admirals for a force of only 1.1 million. Now, during World War II, when we had 12.2 million men under arms, we only had 7 4-stars. 7.
Wow, that's
12.2 million. Today we have 44.
That's such a powerful point. And that is, sorry to interrupt, but that is parallel to exactly what's happened in our education system, where we're so heavy on administrators, and it actually, the administrative state, the bureaucracy, far outweighs the actual rank and file boots that are actually doing the work. It's a really powerful point.
Oh, no, absolutely. Then you have to also ask the question, how many of the people that we have on active duty can actually deploy and fight if they have to do it? But, the top issue is this first issue, which is you stop the interventionism, and then you make it clear that we are going to defend the United States, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. We've got people all over the world. Why? We're not under immediate threat of invasion. We should be concerned about what's happening in our own hemisphere. And the only place where there is an invasion ongoing, as you know, is down on the southern border.
Yeah, so that's the one place where we don't have troops. We have military bases in every nook and cranny you can imagine, but 10,000 illegals are able to waltz into our country every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something else that we need to keep in mind. People like Lindsey Graham and all of his supporters, everybody on the Hill, in fact, all the 4-stars, all understand that the bloated force establishment, the bloated overhead, the bloated budget is all tied to overseas expenditure. That's the problem. In other words, you try to get an army general interested in protecting the southern border of the United States, and he looks at you, why? How do I finance extravagant modernization programs of questionable value if all I'm doing is defending America? I mean, that's what you're going to get from these people. How do I justify my bloated rank structure and all these useless headquarters unless I'm fighting somebody overseas?
One of the people I talked to that was involved, it was a U.S. senator, and I called him. I said, what is going on with this? He said, Charlie, off the record, don't say my name, but you could say the essence of this, is that the people involved, Lindsey Graham and his allies in the Senate, were telling McCarthy and we're telling him we're not going to vote for this. And Colonel, they were saying we don't have ammunition. We do not have missiles, that our stockpiles are depleted, that we need new everything. And I just without actually having been in the military, just looking at this as a civilian taxpayer, I know this is rubbish. This is, we spend, the chart you could put up on screen, we spend about $800 billion for our defense budget, 732, but it's probably more than that. And that is more than Brazil, South Korea, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Saudi Arabia, Russia, India, and China combined. I mean, Colonel, I refuse to believe that we need an $800 billion spend every single year, and somehow Lindsey Graham is able to convince people that our munition stockpiles are being depleted. What is the truth?
Well, he's right. But the reason our stockpiles are depleted is that for a very long time, we haven't had to prepare for a real war. Everyone forgets that the opponents that we faced since 2001 have all been weak. They haven't had any armies or air forces or navies or real capability at all. You're facing people with AK-47s and automated mines and so forth. In other words, there's nothing organized out there to fight. Now, we've depleted what stocks we had because we've shipped them over to Europe for use by the Ukrainians, and we've rapidly run out because we were never prepared to begin with to fight a real war. Remember, the whole defense budget is predicated on the notion that somehow or another there's no one in the world that can challenge us, that we're the best, we're the toughest. And by the way, we are going to spend lavishly on all sorts of wonder weapons, miracle weapons that will do wonderful things against any enemy. All of that is nonsense, but it puts a lot of money into people's pockets on the Hill. Remember, you support the defense industries. Their lobbyists are going to reward you. Your political action committees that support you for re-election, they're going to have millions of dollars at their disposal. And there are also foreign lobbies involved in this, because there are foreign lobbies that don't want you to leave the area because they're interested in leveraging us for their own strategic purposes. It's the old tail wags the dog problem. We've got that problem all over the world right now.
Can you give some examples of Ukraine and Russia is an obvious one, but we showed the picture of how many military bases we have. These are not embassies. These are military bases. I mean, for example, we have 25,000 troops in South Korea. Okay, you might be able to make an argument, but the troops in Peru or the troops in Africa, and we have them scattered all across the country, all across the planet, I should say. And Republicans, Colonel, enter into these negotiations with zero willingness to consider any sort of cuts or any sort of adjustments. Colonel, how do you think these negotiations should have been handled from just a leadership standpoint?
Well, let me give you two quick answers. The first thing, you mentioned South Korea. In the 1990s, after Desert Storm, people went back and looked at our war plans for the Korean Peninsula. It was very clear that in the event of an attack, even though then it was very unlikely, all of the aid and assistance that we would provide to the Koreans would come largely from the Navy and the Air Force. And so the question was, well, why are we going to use the Army then? The Army was not terribly interested in Korea. They had bigger fish to fry at the time, they thought, in the Middle East and elsewhere. Finally, Colin Powell interrupted and said, well, we'll maintain a little Army force there to maintain a foothold, and then we'll make the reinforcement for Korea the Marine Corps' mission, because nobody could find anything for the Marine Corps to do, which, by the way, is a problem right now. So these are not new issues, and the generals are always trying to find workarounds to satisfy both themselves and congressional interests to keep the money flowing. So that's the first part of the question needs to be answered. Second is, McCarthy and the so-called Republicans should have stood their ground. They should say, fine, we're not going to vote for it. They should have stonewalled. And when everybody says, well, if you do that, we might default. Well, I've got news for everybody. That's going to happen eventually anyway. We cannot service a $31, $32, $33 trillion debt. It can't be done over the long haul. We might as well act now. Make the hard cuts, make the hard decision, because postponing it means that there'll probably be an attempt to try and inflate our way out, which I don't think is going to work. It could easily ruin and destroy our currency completely, which is already a threat. And then we're in a far worse crisis than anything we face today. Today, we could make prudent changes. No one wants to do it. No one wants the pain. The American people don't want the pain. And so their representatives say, look, I can't do that. I'm going to make all my supporters unhappy.
It's remarkable. And our audience is not having it. I mean, regular, ordinary grassroots folks, they see it. Admiral Mullen, who I've mixed opinions about 10 years ago, was correct. He said the greatest national security risk is the national debt. He said, and that was when the national debt was 10 or 11 trillion dollars. It is now triple that. I mean, you can only imagine, not to mention the unfunded liabilities, the pension obligations, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. You can't touch the defense budget. Boy, if you wanted to destroy the country, if you wanted to see America fall, this is what you would do. You would turn on the guzzle of cheap money and erode the currency. Colonel, I'd like to have you elaborate a little bit more on how the national debt is a serious threat to our national security, more so than Vladimir Putin. I mean, I don't think Putin's much of a threat to America at all, but the consensus in D.C. is Putin is far more of a threat than the lack of spending discipline. Your reaction?
Well, if you have been spending recklessly for decades, you'll use whatever you can find to justify its continuation. That's the sad truth right now. That's why it was so important for the so-called Republicans to stand their ground and say, come what may, this is not going to go any further. We're going to stop it. Unfortunately, they let everybody down. I think that the debt has always been threatening because it threatened to reduce the influx of dollars to defense. And that's very true. But it only works, and it's only a threat if the people in charge will behave prudently. And they're not going to behave prudently. They're going to push us over the abyss. I'm afraid that we're going to live in an environment very shortly that is close to 1929, 30, and 31, an environment we helped to create. Right now in St. Petersburg, Russia, there is a plan to bring together 84 countries.
That's right.
All of whom want to adopt gold as the standard for currency. They want to set up a new currency. And Russia, China, and India, who quite frankly at this point control most of the world's gold, are leading the charge, and they're all going to join them because they want to get out from under us. We're bankrupting everybody else. When you spend dollars and you give other people your dollar, you're passing on our debt. They don't want to deal with it anymore.